Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds makes for a wholly amazing, wholly delicious experience that's, well, wholly Hershey's. Everyone should get to experience the satisfying surprise of a whole almond tucked inside creamy Hershey's chocolate. So don't wait your whole life to try Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds. And if you've already had it, then chances are you're already a lifelong fan of this confectionery delight. Find Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds wherever candy is sold.
And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And, I've tried to kind of vary things a little bit recently. And I hit upon, actually, when I was speaking last week to Toby Manning about Brian Wilson, question about what it is that famous recording artists mean in terms of how they symbolically represent changing ideas of, say, for example, social class or anxieties of the moment, or questions around gender or sexuality. That's what to me is important, historically important about. I'm going to talk about David Bowie today, but about key iconic musical figures and cinematic figures. I mean, I know a few weeks ago we were talking about the Black Oscar winners, people like Sidney Poitier, for example. And when we watch artists on the screen, on the stage, part of the relationship we're having with them is all about the ways in which we make sense of things, the ways in which we make meaning out of things. And if you want to talk about what culture is broadly, it is the creation of a shared, combined, collective sense of meaning in cultures and subcultures. Now, there's like about a million things more nuanced to say about that, and I don't want to go back into my old days of many years ago of lecturing on popular culture. But I do want to dive into an amazing book that I haven't picked up in years, which is David Bowie, Fame, Sound and Vision by Nick Stephenson. And I think the key thing that I'm interested in is, just as we talked about Brian Wilson the other week, about how Wilson and the Beach Boys have been produced by the 50s and they kind of collide with the 60s. Bowie is a product of the 60s, and he meets his kind of moment in the 70s, where all the things I think that have been kind of cooking under the surface in the 60s during the kind of the brief flowering of the British counterculture suddenly become they actually find their fullest expression in the 70s, and perhaps to some extent even in the 1980s, but skewed in all sorts of different ways. So, to begin, this section of the book is called Bowie in the 60s, The Making of a Star. Nick Stephenson writes, "The 1960s remain a period of intense ideological contestation. Viewed from the political right, the emergence of the permissive society and antisocial individualism has led to increasing levels of drug abuse, crime, antisocial behaviour, family breakdown and social atomization. The lifestyle revolts of the 60s, in this view, fostered a host of liberal freedoms from which modern society is still learning to recover. The causes of social breakdown are variously blamed upon the rise of youth cultures, consumerism, and the radical ambitions of the counterculture. And many on the political right would have argued, or did argue at the time, that kind of Thatcher was the sort of the antidote to all of this. Long before Thatcher was openly articulating a kind of free market revolution, which actually takes many of these trends from the 60s and supercharges them: individualism, consumerism, family breakdown, social atomization, all key features of the 1980s. She was talking about the return to essentially a kind of a more Victorian or Edwardian morality, that just happened to include these kind of repressive family values, but also a kind of a war on the idea of welfare. Thatcherism is all about a different kind of individualism, not about sort of pleasure-seeking hedonism and spirituality, but the individualism of I'm not contributing to the rest of society. I don't see why I should. That kind of thing. Anyway, not to want to go on about her too much, but her base idea was that welfare is an evil because it makes the decision to charitably give, the decision to be good, the choice to be good, it takes that away from individuals, which is a sort of a preposterously stupid philosophy, of course, as no modern welfare system could function that way. But there you have it. Anyway, back to Bowie. The enhancement of freedom as opposed to conformity required by a well-ordered and well-regulated society is bemoaned by moralizers and populist right-wing commentators. Left-wing inspired accounts of the 60s, on the other hand, view the decade more progressively, if no less ambivalently. The 60s witnessed the rise of new experiments in identity politics based on questions of respect and recognition, the birth of the idea that the personal is political, and that the contemporary culture could offer arresting images and ideas all come from this decade. Yet most left-inspired readings of the 60s usually end with the triumph of commodification rather than liberation, the defeat of the counterculture, and the triumph of ephemeral cultures of fashion and mass consumption led directly to the selfish neoliberalism of modern times. The notion that popular music and culture seemed to offer possibilities of personal and collective transformation was soon displaced once these sentiments became incorporated into the system through commodification. This process ultimately ends with the stars of the 60s enjoying glamorous lifestyles and global forms of visibility, while trading upon more authentic sentiments of rebellion available within their earlier work. And that, this is kind of absolutely true of Bowie. There's a great book, for the life of me, I can't remember who it was by, on the kind of the rise and fall of the rock star as the idea, and the rock star has to, there are certain key kind of characteristics one has to kind of manifest in order to be viewed as a rock star. You have to live this kind of outrageous fantasy lifestyle of stretched limousines and country houses and cocaine and champagne and Rolls Royces and wild outfits and performative kind of sexuality and all this kind of stuff. And Bowie certainly, whilst articulating countercultural ideas in the 60s, and then this kind of blend of sort of science fiction and gender bending kind of reimagining of the self in the 70s becomes, by the 1980s, the very definition of the kind of the MTV rock star, of which it kind of, there are some gems in that era like Let's Dance, but it's not one of his finer periods. These images of the 60s remain powerful within contemporary culture, whereas the 70s are often seen as a period of lost innocence before the onset of the cynical market-driven 80s. the 60s still evoke a clear sense of contestation, yet the projections of both right and left arguably obscure as much as they reveal. Rather than reading the development of the counterculture and rock music as either revolutionary or reactionary, this book argues that the popular culture needs to be understood more precisely within its political and cultural context. This means that the use of popular music of the period resists a unitary reading as either essentially radical or reactionary. Too many critics of the cultural productions of the 60s, through simple binary oppositions, too many critics view the cultural productions of the 60s through simply binary oppositions. Sorry for the muddle there. The mass appeal of popular music during this period can only be poorly understood as a cheap form of distraction not worthy of serious forms of consideration, or as the lost spirit of rebellion our own era would do well to recapture. By viewing popular music and culture as either a culture of containment or progress, we displace many other questions. In this chapter, we explore a story about how the 60s made David Bowie, but also press the view that questions of culture are best understood through less sweeping but no less critical viewpoints. So it's very difficult. I mean, one of the things about Bowie the artist is immensely contested figure, not least through his fans, who if you talk to any earnest Bowie fans, they will have innumerable opinions on his various kind of periods of work. I think that it is useful if you look at Bowie, the Beatles, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, the Who, any of the period, any artists that emerged from the 60s into the 70s, to try to look at them not as it says here, simply disposable popular culture, or to imagine that they were, lone revolutionaries against the system, because they're kind of neither of these things. And those are two particularly naive readings, I would argue. Instead, they're products of mass consumption of the 1960s. They're products of mass consumerism, but they seem to articulate something of the politics emerging in the 1960s around the development, around ideas around the individual, which are really kind of possible at scale only because of mass culture. People had the income to literally look, and there was a kind of a consumer culture around them where they can buy different looks from different shops and decide whether they're going to be rockers or mods, that kind, or hippies or what have you. Affluence brings choice, but also we're in a kind of a period in the mid 20th century where the ideas from and you find ideas in Bowie's music from people like Jean Genet, for example, who Jean Genie is sort of about the revolutionary French thinker and artist who was kind of good friends with the Black Panthers. There are these radical undercurrents which are with artists like Bowie are kind of played with sometimes. There's a kind of like a nod and wink irony to them, to their usage, and sometimes there's a kind of a deep sincerity to them as well. While seeking to understand British and American society during the 60s, there are a number of different ways of understanding this most contested of decades. Further, that whilst Bowie is usually and most correctly thought of as the face of the 70s, it's undoubtedly that the 60s made him. As we shall see, the counterculture, swinging London, and the artistic underground all contributed to the making of David Bowie. If the 60s can be seen as the time when consumerism, mass communications, lifestyle experimentation, and new politics of gender and sexuality all came of age, then they all feed into the development of the international star image of David Bowie. Rather than understanding the 60s as a time of liberation or moral decline, the decade is better understood as a symbol of the desire for change. Obviously, hunky-dory, changes, there you go. As we shall see, the idea that individuals or social movements could change themselves by refashioning their identities through commercial culture and radical ideas is a product of the 60s. The decade opened the possibility that ordinary consumer goods or services like the record player, the television set, and the broadcast of popular music could threaten the established rules of authority and morality. The aesthetic changes in popular music pioneered through the star images of Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix, amongst others, ultimately defeat the idea that the market automatically produces dumbed-down products for duped consumers. It was the coming together of radical politics, star images, and the consumption of popular music that was to win out over the simplistic ideologies of both the right and the left.
Listen up! You can get the new iPhone 16e with Apple Intelligence for just $49.99 when you switch to Boost Mobile. We pulled so many all-nighters to give you this deal, and hey, stop messing with the mic!
I'm just helping us catch people's attention. This is a great deal!
Exactly, so it doesn't need all that.
Fine.
Get the new iPhone 16e, available at Apple Store locations and the Apple Store online.
Visit your nearest Boost Mobile store for full offer details. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later. Restrictions apply.
Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds makes for a wholly amazing, wholly delicious experience that's, well, wholly Hershey's. Everyone to get to experience the satisfying surprise of a whole almond tucked inside creamy Hershey's chocolate. So don't wait your whole life to try Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds. And if you've already had it, then chances are you're already a lifelong fan of this confectionery delight. Find Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds wherever candy is sold.
There was a story about that kind of tribune of the left, Tony Benn, in the 1960s, that he wanted to shut down pirate radio. Why? Well, firstly, it was a challenge to the BBC, the voice of the establishment. Secondly, Benn, whilst a figure of the left, is not necessarily a figure of the counterculture. He was a kind of, in many ways, a kind of a politically and socially radical thinker, but kind of had his own little conservatisms as well. And there's this kind of misconception about the British left in the 60s as it being this homogenous bloc, as you can see from that story. And there is a counterculture, and the counterculture it isn't necessarily uniformly left at all. You have key figures of the counterculture who go on to be exceedingly wealthy and sort of quite Tory sympathetic in the 1980s and 1990s. You have figures such as the publishing multimillionaire Felix Dennis, who, whilst never a Tory, was certainly not a figure of. He was a figure of the counterculture in the 60s, but not necessarily a countercultural figure of the left. He wasn't ever proposing any sort of kind of anti-capitalist revolution, and was very, very determined to be wealthy. So the kind of the dividing line between left and right, and between culture and counterculture, is very, very blurred and very, very messy. And the idea, and somewhere in that you have various stars that appropriate the language, not necessarily of the left, but the kind of the language of radicalism, the performance of radicalism, but are commercial entities, huge commercial entities in their own right. Someone like David Bowie doesn't work without large quantities of money. It's part of how stardom starts to be kind of configured throughout the 60s and into the 70s. You look at the stars of the 50s, and many of them are on quite modest incomes. And there's been something of a kind of like an earnings revolution. And this is a period where the Rolling Stones had to, 1970, had to go abroad to record Exile on Main Street to avoid the Heath government's taxes. So it reads, the book. The reinvention of popular culture. The 50s was a period of middle-class stylistic revolts and connected to the emergence of the Beats in America and angry young men in Britain. Admittedly, the numbers directly affected by these artistic and cultural movements were probably small, but their impact upon later generations was immense. Just as the youth-oriented popular music of the 50s and 60s unsettled the established cultural order, these artistic movements had a similar effect. The Beats, whose most famous members were poet Allen Ginsberg and writers Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, seemed to characterize those who tried to live outside the mainstream. This was mainly a white middle-class culture which protested against the blandness and conformity of American life. Bowie often talked about the dullness of the desire to escape suburbia and the blandness of it and dullness of it. Bohemianism and rebelliousness were signified through the exploration of drugs, black culture, jazz, and the image of the outsider. Similarly, the angry young men of the 50s in Britain, whose generation included John Osborne, Kingsley Amis, and philosopher Colin Wilson, held similar contempt for the domestic arrangements of middle-class suburbia. Kingsley Amis obviously becoming an arch reactionary later on. Whilst the angry young men remained more distant from the impact of rock and roll and popular music, they shared similar anger with straight family life. Many feminists, like Lynn Segal, have argued that these literary formations can be understood as a specifically masculine rebellion against stifling domesticity. The men represented within this literature articulate a contempt for femininity and a sense of entrapment with unheroic suburban forms of masculinity. Many of the characters in the kitchen sink movies of the 1950s and early 1960s they're not sort of working class revolutionaries, but they're working class guys that want a bit of the good time. They want money in their pocket and they want to go down the pub and have good times, sleep with beautiful women, and they resent where they are in terms of their class status. But they're not looking to overthrow the social order, they're looking to do well out of it. And which happens in these stories to differing degrees. David Bowie is as much a product of the 50s and the 60s as rock and roll and the moon landings. Like many of his generation, from the beat poets to the counterculture, Bowie grew up in a generation that sought to question the rigidities of decent straight masculinity. However, Bowie was to become a different kind of rebel male. While much rock music of this period can indeed be understood as a masculine rejection of femininity and domesticity, this is only the part of the Bowie story. For Bowie would go on to pervert the by now predictable tale of rock and roll of the self-indulgent lifestyle. If Bowie was to become a playboy, it was of a very different kind.
Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds makes for a wholly amazing, wholly delicious experience that's, well, wholly Hershey's. Everyone should get to experience the satisfying surprise of a whole almond tucked inside creamy Hershey's chocolate. So don't wait your whole life to try Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds. And if you've already had it, then chances are you're already a lifelong fan of this confectionery delight. Find Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds wherever candy is sold.
Bowie, obviously, by the 1970s, has discovered the source initially of his fame. He's discovered his brand. Bowie's a kind of, in the 60s, tries numerous things. Sometimes he's a mod, sometimes he's a hippie. None of this is particularly successful. When he talks openly about being bisexual, which he later recants, and his performance as Ziggy Stardust is effeminate and camp. In 1972, when Starman breaks Bowie on Top of the Pops, and he's there with his kind of arm around Mick Ronson, something that we would find kind of totally innocuous now, but was at that moment seemed really quite shocking and an indication of homosexuality and all this kind of stuff, but was like a kind of like a lightning rod for generations of young people. There are stars such as Holly Johnson of Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys and Alan Cumming, the actor, or gay and bisexual men who saw Bowie on that performance and said, "Wow, there is somebody like me." And then there were heterosexual people who watched the performance, heterosexual men who watched the performance, and recognized that there's just a different kind of masculinity out there. And it becomes by the 1980s, if you look at many of the new romantic and synthwave performers of the 1980s, Bowie's androgyny, his influence on ideas around masculinity in Britain at the very least, and potentially beyond, has become hegemonic. That was somebody that everybody from Steve Strange to Duran Duran wanted to be, or wanted to kind of emulate or model themselves on. So in this, I guess I'll do some more on Bowie another time. But I think that the takeaway here are these things: is that Bowie signifies by the 70s the changes that had taken place in the 60s, the contested nature of radicalism and fame, the contested nature of gender, and he is a kind of the product of these debates, these changes, and these social conflicts that finds expression in music and film. But there's a lot more to be said about him than that. Anyway, thanks so much. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
Federal missions demand efficiency. At GDIT, efficiency means streamlining government operations, automating citizen services, and saving the government over $1 billion a year detecting and preventing fraud. We bring proven AI, cloud, and software development solutions to the forefront of driving efficiencies, delivering savings of up to 40%. Because at GDIT, efficiency isn't just possible, it's built in. Learn more at gdit.com.
Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds makes for a wholly amazing, wholly delicious experience that's, well, wholly Hershey's. Everyone's to get to experience the satisfying surprise of a whole almond tucked inside creamy Hershey's chocolate. So don't wait your whole life to try Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds. And if you've already had it, then chances are you're already a lifelong fan of this confectionery delight. Find Hershey's milk chocolate with whole almonds wherever candy is sold.